Vernon Cassidy slid the credit application back across the counter that gray November morning without looking up from it a second time. "Corporates tightened the policy on accounts past due," Vernon said. "I can't extend you anything else until the balance clears, and I can't make an exception, even for a name that's been on our books as long as yours has. You might try the co-op over in the next county. They run their credit a little looser than we're allowed to anymore." Foster Lane was 29 years old that particular November, standing at the counter of the same feed store his father had bought from for 30 years before the regional chain acquired it, holding a list of everything his herd needed to survive a winter he could no longer afford outright. His wife Callie was 6 weeks into a hospital stay 200 miles away that had already eaten through every dollar the farm's thin margins had ever managed to save, and the drought that same summer had cut his hay yield nearly in half, leaving him with a herd of 80 head and a long stretch of cold winter months ahead, with nowhere near enough feed on hand to see the whole herd safely. Through it, Foster stood there a long moment, the list of everything his herd needed still in his own hand, and felt the particular sting of a refusal that carried no malice in it at all. Only a policy with no room left for 30 years of his own family's history at that counter. "I understand," Foster said, finally, quiet and even. "Thank you for your time." The manager told him to try the next county. He said thank you and never forgot it. He drove home that afternoon in a silence that felt, to him, less like defeat than like the particular stillness before a decision he hadn't fully made yet, but could already feel taking shape somewhere underneath the humiliation. His father, Walton Lane, had run that farm for 38 years before a heart attack took him at 61, 5 years before that November afternoon. And Walton had said one thing about debt more often than any other piece of advice he'd left his son, standing at the same feed store counter decades earlier with cash in hand instead of a credit application. "Nobody starves waiting on someone else's ledger," Walton used to say. "Feed what's yours first, with what's actually yours, and you'll never have to stand at a counter hoping a stranger decides you're worth the risk." Foster had heard that sentence 100 times growing up, and had mostly filed it away as an old man's stubbornness about borrowing money, a philosophy that had kept the farm modest but solvent through Walton's whole working life. He understood it differently, driving home from that counter with an empty truck bed and 80 head of cattle depending on him, than he ever had as a boy standing beside his father in that same store. Callie's illness had come on suddenly that August, a diagnosis neither of them had seen coming, requiring a specialized treatment center 200 miles away that meant Foster spent every other week driving 4 hours each direction just to sit with her for a single afternoon, before turning around to get back to the herd by morning chores. The hospital bills had arrived faster than either of them could track, and Foster had watched across 3 months. The modest savings account he and his father had built over decades drained down to almost nothing. The same account that would once have easily covered a season's feed bill outright, without a second thought. He had not told Callie, on his visits, exactly how thin the farm's finances had gotten, not wanting to add that weight to whatever she was already carrying through her own treatment. And it was that particular loneliness, driving 4 hours home after each visit with no one to talk the day's worries through with, that had made the feed store's refusal land harder than it might have otherwise. He'd walked into that counter that November morning already exhausted in a way most of the county didn't know about. And Vernon's careful, policy-bound refusal had simply been the last thing that afternoon he didn't have the reserves left to absorb gracefully. He did not go home in panic, though the drive back gave him plenty of time to consider whether he should. He went home instead and made a list, working at the kitchen table that same night with a pencil and a legal pad, of every resource he actually had, rather than every resource he'd hoped a line of credit might provide, and by morning he had a plan that would have looked, to anyone at that feed store counter, like nothing more than a desperate man scrambling, but that carried, underneath the scrambling, the beginning of something Foster himself would not fully recognize as a real plan for another 2 years. He called his nearest neighbor first, an older rancher named Dewey Fasland, who had known Walton for 40 years and had watched Foster grow up on that same road. Dewey had more standing hay than he needed that season, his own herd smaller than it had been a decade earlier, and he offered Foster a private arrangement on the spot. Hay traded not for cash Foster didn't have, but for 2 months of Foster's own labor, helping Dewey with fence work and equipment repair through the coming spring. An arrangement built entirely on the kind of trust a corporate credit policy had no mechanism for extending. "Your daddy helped me through a bad winter once, long before you were born," Dewey told him. "I don't forget things like that, even if the feed store apparently does." He called Callie that same night from the kitchen table, careful to keep his voice steady, and told her only the outline of the plan rather than the full weight of what the refusal had cost him emotionally. "We're going to be fine," he told her. "Dewey's got hay, and I picked up some welding work. I don't want you worrying about this on top of everything else you're already carrying." "You're not fooling me, Foster Lane," Callie said, her voice thin but still carrying the particular sharpness he'd fallen in love with a decade earlier. "I know exactly what that store means to you, and I know exactly what your daddy would say about all this. Do what you need to do. Just promise me you won't let pride talk you into something reckless, trying to prove a point to a man behind a counter." "I promise," Foster said, and meant it, though he understood, even saying it, that the line between principle and pride was going to be harder to hold than the promise made it sound. Foster spent that whole winter working 2 jobs at once, his own herd and Dewey's fence lines both, alongside picking up welding shifts 3 days a week for a regional oilfield services company that paid cash and asked no questions about credit history. Work he'd learned as a teenager helping his father maintain equipment and had never expected to lean on as an actual income source. Working Dewey's fence lines that winter had taught Foster something he hadn't expected to learn from an arrangement he'd originally seen as simple survival. Dewey ran his own small operation with a discipline Foster's father had always admired, but that Foster himself had never fully absorbed as a young man too busy, resenting his father's caution to study its actual mechanics. And the long hours mending wire and repairing equipment together gave the 2 men time to talk through decades of hard-won ranching wisdom that Foster found himself, for the first time, genuinely hungry to learn, rather than simply tolerate. "Your daddy used to tell me the same thing about debt, he told you," Dewey said one cold February afternoon, the 2 of them working a stretch of fence in weather that made every task twice as slow. "Difference is, I think you're actually going to listen to it, where he mostly just repeated it at you, hoping it'd take eventually." "Feels like it's taking now," Foster admitted. Took a humiliating afternoon at that counter to finally hear it properly. He sold off 15 head that November, rather than risk feeding all 80 through a shortage, a hard, practical culling he hated making but understood. Watching his father's old ledgers was exactly the kind of decision Walton would have made rather than borrow against animals he couldn't guarantee feeding properly. The herd survived that winter thinner than Foster would have liked, but alive, every animal accounted for. And by spring he had paid Dewey back in full labor, cleared the past due balance the feed store had cut him off over, and started, almost without consciously deciding to, the first of what would become a 5-year pattern of quiet. Compounding decisions nobody on that road was watching closely enough to notice adding up to anything. If you've ever been humiliated by an institution that owed you nothing personal, but still managed to make the refusal feel like a verdict on your whole character, you know the particular quiet a person carries afterward, not bitterness exactly. More a decision to build something that never again depends on a stranger's ledger deciding whether you're worth the risk. The welding work led, that first spring, to something Foster hadn't anticipated. Several of the smaller ranchers he'd met through oilfield contract jobs mentioned, in passing, how hard it had become to source affordable custom feed rations since the corporate chain took over the local store. Prices climbing steadily as centralized purchasing replaced the personal, flexible arrangements the old family-owned store used to offer regular customers. Foster, who had grown up watching his father mix custom rations by hand for their own herd, started doing the same thing for two neighbors that spring almost as a favor, buying grain directly from a regional grower he'd met through Dewey and blending it himself in Walton's old equipment, at a price considerably below what the corporate store charged for a comparable custom mix. Learning to blend a proper custom ration took Foster most of that first spring to relearn well enough to trust with a paying customer's herd, working from memory of watching his father do it as a boy, and a stack of extension bulletins he ordered through the county library to fill in the gaps his memory couldn't cover on its own. He ruined 2 full batches that first month. One mixed too heavy on protein for the cattle it was meant for, another that separated badly in storage because he'd gotten the moisture content wrong. Small private failures he absorbed himself rather than risk delivering to a paying customer, testing every new formulation on his own herd first before he trusted it with anyone else's animals. Word moved slowly at first, the way real change moves through a farming community more accustomed to buying from whatever store happened to be closest. But by that first summer, Foster had 6 regular customers for his hand-mixed rations. A modest side business he ran mostly on evenings and weekends around his welding shifts and his own herd's needs. Financed entirely out of cash rather than any credit line, exactly the way his father had always insisted a real operation ought to run. Vernon Cassidy heard about it eventually, the way most business news traveled through that county's small network of farmers and suppliers, and mentioned it once at the feed store counter to a customer who happened to repeat the comment back to Foster within the week. "Vernon says you're running some kind of backyard feed operation," the customer told him, half amused. "Says it won't last past the first bad grain harvest, once you're competing against real supply contracts instead of whatever you can scrounge locally." Foster said nothing in response and kept mixing rations. Callie came home from the treatment center that second spring, her own recovery slow but steady, and found a husband whose evenings had changed shape entirely in her absence. No longer just chores and worry, but a small, growing enterprise conducted out of the same equipment shed his father had once used. Ledgers spread across the kitchen table most nights where hospital bills used to sit instead. "You built this while I was gone," she said, standing in the shed doorway, watching him weigh out a batch for a customer's morning pickup. "Built it because of what happened while you were gone," Foster said. Wasn't sure at first whether that made it something to be proud of, or just something born out of spite. Took me a while to decide it could be both. Callie took over the business's bookkeeping that same spring, a task Foster had been managing on scraps of paper and rough memory, and her steady, methodical tracking of every customer account, every grain purchase, every dollar in and out, gave Lane Custom Feed a level of real financial discipline that Foster's own instinct for the work had never quite provided on its own. By his second year, Foster's side business had grown enough that he quietly incorporated it, naming it simply Lane Custom Feed, and began sourcing grain not just from the single regional grower Dewey had introduced him to, but from a small network of 4 growers across 2 counties, diversifying his supply the way his father's old ledgers, which Foster had begun studying seriously that same year, had always warned was the only real protection against a single bad season wiping out an entire operation. The setback came in his 3rd year, and it very nearly ended the whole undertaking before it had the chance to become anything more than a promising side business. A batch of corn Foster sourced from a new grower he hadn't fully vetted came in carrying a mycotoxin contamination invisible to casual inspection, a fungal toxin that developed in grain stored improperly during a wet harvest season, and Foster, working fast to fill a backlog of orders, blended it into custom rations for 3 of his customers before a 4th customer's veterinarian, called out for an unrelated matter, happened to notice symptoms in a small herd that pointed toward feed contamination and traced it back to Foster's operation within the week. No animals died, caught early enough that the affected herds recovered fully once the contaminated feed was pulled, but the damage to Foster's reputation, built carefully over 2 years of word-of-mouth trust, struck deeper than any financial loss the recall itself cost him. The new grower Foster had brought into his network that season, a young farmer named Marcus Odell, who'd only recently taken over his own family's operation, had assured Foster the corn had been dried and stored properly through what had been an unusually wet harvest. And Foster, trusting a fellow young farmer over the more rigorous testing his father's caution might have recommended, had accepted the assurance without independently verifying it, exactly the kind of shortcut a growing business under order pressure sometimes talks itself into taking. "I trusted you specifically because you weren't the corporate store," one of the affected customers told him, standing in his own barnyard with an expression that carried more disappointment than anger. "I figured a man mixing feed himself would catch something like this before it ever reached my herd." Callie found him in the shed that same evening, sitting on an overturned bucket amid the ruined batches, and sat down beside him without saying much at first. "You're not the man who caused this," she said eventually. "You're the man who's about to figure out how to fix it. Those aren't the same thing, and I need you to remember the difference before you spend all night convincing yourself otherwise." "Feels like the same thing right now," Foster admitted. "It isn't," Callie said. "Your daddy lost part of a hay crop once too. Remember, didn't stop him running that farm another 20 years. He went inside once Callie finally coaxed him off the bucket and sat alone at the same kitchen table where he'd made his first desperate list 5 years earlier, and let himself think, for the first time since that November afternoon at the feed store counter, the thing he had not let himself think through 2 years of careful, compounding progress. Nobody starves waiting on someone else's ledger. His father's sentence came back to him that night, and for one long tired hour it felt less like guidance and more like a rule that had finally caught up to its own limits. Because feeding what was his with what was actually his had just poisoned 3 neighbors' herds through his own oversight. And no amount of self-reliance changed the fact that trust, once broken, didn't rebuild itself on stubbornness alone. He did not quit, though he sat with the temptation to a while longer than he later liked to admit. Somewhere close to midnight, reading back through his father's old ledgers a second time, he found a section he'd skimmed past too quickly the first time. A series of entries from a bad year decades earlier, when Walton himself had lost a portion of a hay crop to improper curing, and a note in the margin describing exactly how he'd rebuilt customer trust afterward, not through excuses, but through a formal testing protocol he'd adopted for every subsequent harvest, expensive and time-consuming, but the only thing that had ever actually restored confidence, a mistake like that one cost. Marcus Odell, the young grower whose improperly stored corn, had caused the whole crisis. Drove out to Foster's place himself once he heard about the recall, expecting, by his own later admission, to be told his supply contract was finished for good. Instead, Foster showed him the margin note from Walton's old ledger, the same one that had shown him the path forward that night, and asked whether Marcus would be willing to be the network's first grower to submit to the new testing protocol Foster intended to build, a partnership rather than a dismissal. "Most men would have just cut me loose," Marcus said. "Most men didn't grow up watching my daddy rebuild the exact same kind of trust after the exact same kind of mistake," Foster said. "I'm not interested in punishing you for something we both should have caught sooner. I'm interested in making sure neither of us makes this particular mistake twice." Foster invested that same month in proper grain testing equipment, a real cost against a business that had barely turned a profit yet, and instituted a formal protocol requiring every batch of source grain to test clean before it ever touched his mixing equipment, a standard stricter than anything the corporate feed store itself required of its own centralized supply chain. He personally apologized to each affected customer, covered their veterinary costs in full, even though 2 of the 3 told him it wasn't necessary, and rebuilt the business over the following year on a foundation considerably more rigorous than the one that had nearly collapsed it. What would you have done 3 years into a 5-year plan, watching a single oversight threaten to undo everything you'd built out of nothing but hard evenings and a stubborn refusal to depend on anyone else's credit? Foster chose to rebuild rather than retreat, And it was that choice, more than any single decision before it, that finally turned Lane Custom Feed from a promising side business into something the whole county would eventually take seriously. The two customers who'd stood by him through the recall, rather than moving their business elsewhere, became, over the following year, the loudest advocates for exactly the reputation Foster had feared he'd destroyed. He didn't hide from it. One of them told a skeptical neighbor at the feed store that same spring, unaware Vernon was within easy earshot of the conversation, covered our vet bills without being asked, and now every batch gets tested before it leaves his shed. I trust that store's operation more now than I did before the mistake happened, if I'm honest about it. By his fourth year, Foster's grain testing standard had become, in its own quiet way, the thing that finally distinguishes operation from the corporate stores in a manner customers could actually see and trust rather than simply hear about secondhand. He had 22 regular customers by then, still running the operation out of his father's old equipment shed, still mixing every batch by hand himself, rather than scaling into anything resembling the corporate store's automated systems. And it was that same year, during a regional grain shortage that hit the whole area hard, that the difference between his diversified, personally vetted supply network and the corporate store's centralized purchasing finally became impossible for anyone on that road to ignore. The shortage, driven by a poor regional harvest combined with rising transportation costs, hit the corporate chain's centralized supply contracts especially hard. Their bulk purchasing agreements locked into suppliers 2 states away, who simply couldn't fill orders fast enough once demand spiked across the whole region. Vernon Cassidy's store ran short on basic feedstock for nearly 6 weeks that winter, turning away customers the same way Foster himself had once been turned away, while Foster's smaller, more diversified network of 4 regional growers, none of them large enough to be squeezed the same way the corporate chain's bulk contracts were, kept every one of his 22 customers supplied without a single interruption. I hate to admit this, Dewey Faslin told him that winter, watching Foster load rations into a customer's truck, but you've built something in 5 years that the corporate store's national buying power apparently can't match when it actually matters. That's not luck. That's just better thinking applied consistently, longer than anybody else was willing to apply it. Foster had, by that 4th winter, expanded his grower network to 7 regional farms, each vetted personally and each submitting samples to the testing protocol before any grain entered his mixing operation, a level of oversight that cost him real money and time, but that he had come to see. Since the recall, as simply the price of doing business honestly rather than an optional expense to trim when margins got tight. Callie's bookkeeping showed, that same year, the business finally clearing a genuine profit beyond covering its own costs. Modest, but real. The first money either of them had set aside since her hospital bills had drained the original savings account 5 years earlier. Your daddy would have liked the testing protocol, Callie told him that winter, reviewing the year's numbers at the kitchen table. Not because it's cautious, because it's honest about what could go wrong instead of just hoping nothing does. Vernon Cassidy's own position at the feed store grew increasingly precarious that same winter. Corporate leadership questioning why a rural location with steadily declining sales kept missing regional performance targets, and it was in the spring following that shortage, Foster's 5th year since the credit refusal, that word reached him, through Dewey, and through 2 of his own regular customers who still shopped occasionally at the corporate store, that the chain had quietly put the location up for sale, unwilling to keep investing in a rural market their centralized model had proven. That winter, it could no longer reliably serve. The decision to actually pursue the purchase, rather than simply feel a private satisfaction at the corporate chain's struggles, took Foster the better part of a difficult week of conversations with Callie at that same kitchen table where the whole undertaking had first begun. It's a real risk, Callie said, reviewing the numbers with him one evening. Buying a whole store is not the same as growing a side business slow and careful the way we've done everything else. I know, Foster said, but it's the same principle, just bigger. Cash we've actually got, a business we understand from the inside out, and a chance to fix something that felt broken the day it turned me away. I don't think I forgive myself if I don't at least try. Callie studied the numbers a while longer before she finally nodded. Then we try, she said. Same as everything else. Careful, and with our own money, not somebody else's ledger. Foster had by then built enough capital through 5 years of careful, cash-based reinvestment. No debt anywhere in the operation the way his father had always insisted, to seriously consider what would have seemed. That first November afternoon at the counter, like an impossible fantasy. He met with the corporate chain's regional divestment representative that spring, presenting 5 years of Lane Custom Feeds financial records alongside a formal offer to purchase the location outright. An offer built entirely on cash reserves and a modest loan from a bank that had, by then, watched him operate debt-free and profitably for half a decade. The regional divestment representative, a brisk businesslike woman named Denise Pruitt, reviewed Foster's 5 years of records with visible surprise partway through the meeting, setting down the folder to look at him directly. Most offers we get on underperforming rural locations come from bigger regional chains looking to consolidate, she said. I don't think I've had a single independent operator walk in with debt-free financials this clean in 11 years doing this job. Whatever you did to build this, I'd study it if I were corporate, instead of just selling off the location and moving on. I built it out of getting turned away at that exact counter 5 years ago, Foster told her. Might be worth mentioning that in whatever report you file. The sale closed that summer. 5 years almost to the month since Vernon had slid his credit application back across that same counter. And Foster walked into the store on a Tuesday morning, not as a customer this time, but with the deed itself in hand. Vernon Cassidy was still working the counter that morning, having stayed on through the sale process at corporate's request to help manage the transition, and he looked up from the register with an expression that shifted over the course of several long seconds from routine customer greeting to genuine dawning recognition. "Mr. Lane," Vernon said, careful, uncertain exactly how the sentence was supposed to end. "Foster's fine," Foster said. "I own the store now. Vernon closed on it yesterday afternoon." Vernon stood very still behind the counter, the particular stillness of a man reckoning, all at once, with 5 years of a decision he'd made following corporate policy to the letter, never imagining the man he'd turned away that November afternoon would someday be the one signing his paycheck. "I was only ever following the policy I was given," Vernon said finally. "Careful. I want you to know plainly that none of it was personal, whatever it might have looked like from where you were standing that particular morning." "I believe you, Vernon. And I meant what I said," Foster said. "I'm not here to make any of this personal now either, 5 years on. I'd like you to keep running the counter, if you're willing. You know this store's customers better than anyone, and I've got no interest in firing a man for doing his job the way corporate told him to do it. I do intend to change the credit policy starting today. Nobody who's kept a clean account for 5 years gets turned away in a hard season without at least a real conversation first." Vernon did not have an immediate answer ready for that. Standing behind a counter he'd fully expected, walking into work that particular morning, to be managing under an entirely different set of instructions from an entirely different kind of owner altogether. "I'd like very much to stay on if you'll have me," he said finally. "And I'd like to say, plainly and without hedging, that I'm sorry for how that whole conversation went 5 years ago. I think about it more often than you'd probably guess if I'm being honest with you. I think about that particular morning plenty too, even now," Foster said. "Mostly with gratitude at this point. I'm not sure I'd build any of this without that refusal pushing me toward it first." Dewey Fasland was among the first to hear the news, stopping by that same week to see the store for himself, walking the aisles he'd shopped for 4 decades under 3 different sets of ownership now. Your daddy would have stood right here grinning like a fool, Dewey told him, resting a hand on the same counter Vernon had once refused Foster across. I don't say that lightly. I watched that man carry a lot of quiet disappointment over the years about things that never quite came together the way he hoped. This would have undone every bit of it. I think about that most days, Foster admitted. Wish he'd lived to see it. Feels like half the reason I kept going some weeks. He saw the start of it, Dewey said. Raised a son who thinks the exact same way he did about a ledger. That's most of the work, if you ask me. The rest was just time. The community's response to the sale moved through the county the way real news always did, faster than any single conversation could carry it. And within the first month, Foster had reopened credit accounts on his own more flexible terms for 11 local farmers Vernon's corporate policy had cut off over the preceding 2 years. Several of them men who had, like Foster once had, simply needed a hard season's worth of grace rather than a permanent verdict on their character. Marcus Odell became, that same fall, the store's first formally contracted grower under the new testing standard Foster expanded store-wide, a partnership neither man had imagined possible standing in a barnyard 2 years earlier, discussing a recall that had nearly ended everything. Foster hired Colton Barrow, a young man Marcus knew through a nearby heritage hog operation, to help manage the grain testing lab he built in what had once been the store's dusty back storage room. And within a year, the store's testing protocol had become, quietly, the reason 3 neighboring counties worth of farmers started making the longer drive specifically to buy from Foster instead of whichever chain location sat closer to their own front gate. He kept his father's old ledgers on a shelf behind the register, the same worn volumes he'd studied late into that third-year crisis, available now for any customer curious enough to ask about the store's history. And he instituted, store-wide, the same grain testing protocol he'd built for Lane Custom Feed, a standard that made his store, within its first full year under his ownership, the most trusted supplier in 3 counties, rather than merely the closest one. Vernon stayed on through that first full year, and, somewhat to Foster's genuine surprise, turned out to be one of the store's steadiest advocates for the new credit policy, having spent 5 years watching, from behind that same counter, exactly how many honest, hard-working families a rigid corporate formula had quietly turned away without ever once accounting for the actual person standing on the other side of the application. I used to think the policy was just protecting the business, Vernon admitted to Foster one slow Tuesday afternoon that winter. Watching you run it different. I've come around to thinking the old policy was just protecting itself from having to make a harder judgment call. That's not the same thing as protecting the business at all. Foster was 34 that summer, 5 years past a counter where a manager had told him to try the next county, standing behind that same counter now with his father's ledgers on the shelf behind him, and a credit policy built on the same principle Walton had spent his whole life practicing without ever calling it a business philosophy at all. Nobody starves waiting on someone else's ledger, he thought that summer, watching a young rancher he didn't yet know well enough to trust with unlimited credit sign a modest, carefully structured account instead of walking away empty-handed the way Foster himself once had. The thought carried none of the bitterness it had carried that first November drive home, nor the doubt it had carried the night of the contamination crisis, sitting alone with a business he'd nearly destroyed through his own oversight. It felt, finally, like the plain truth his father had spent 38 years living by, proven not by luck, but by 5 years of patient, compounding decisions that had, in the end, put the ledger itself into hands that finally understood what it actually cost a person to stand on the wrong side of that counter. Callie walked the store's aisles with him some evenings after closing that first year, the two of them checking inventory together the same unhurried way they'd once reviewed Lane Custom Feed's ledgers at the kitchen table. And she told him once, standing near the same counter where the whole story had started, that she thought the version of Foster who'd driven home that November afternoon 5 years earlier would hardly recognize the man standing beside her now. "I don't know that's true," Foster said. "I think he's still exactly the same man. He just finally got a chance to prove what he already believed about himself that whole drive home. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth keeping from it. Vernon hadn't refused Foster because he was cruel. He refused him because a corporate policy had decided, in a boardroom 2 states away, exactly which risks were acceptable and which weren't, with no room left in the arithmetic for 30 years of a family's honest history at that same counter. But policies built without room for a person's whole story eventually meet the person who builds something bigger than the policy ever accounted for. And sometimes the quietest, most compounding revenge available to anyone is simply refusing to need the thing you were once denied. He thought sometimes, standing behind that counter on a quiet morning before customers arrived, about how easily the whole story might have ended differently if Dewey hadn't offered that first winter's hay, if Callie hadn't pushed him to keep going after the contamination crisis, if Marcus had simply walked away rather than trusting Foster's offer of a second chance instead of a severed contract. None of it had felt, living through any single one of those moments, like the beginning of owning the store that once turned him away. It had only ever felt each time like the next necessary thing standing in front of him, done as carefully and as honestly as he knew how to do it. If you've ever been turned away by an institution that owed you nothing but still managed to make the refusal feel personal, tell us where you're listening from and about the quiet, unglamorous decisions you made afterward, one careful season at a time, that nobody around you was watching closely enough to notice adding up into anything at all. If this story found you today, share it with somebody still compounding their own quiet comeback, one careful season at a time. Whatever counter you were once turned away from, whatever ledger once decided you weren't worth the risk, may you walk back through that same door someday, not angry, not looking for anything so small as revenge, just ready, steady, and finally standing on the right side of the paperwork, the exact same quiet way he did.